They thought his chains made him powerless. Kwame, once a proud warrior, was crammed into the rotting belly of an Atlantic slave ship, beaten, starved, and treated as less than human. The sailors laughed as he stumbled under their whips, never guessing he was watching, waiting, planning. One stormy night, thunder split the sky, and iron snapped beneath his hands. Shackles clattered to the floor, and in a frenzy of blood and fury, Kwame and the others rose. The ship that once carried despair now burned with rebellion, as captives turned masters and sailors became prisoners. But freedom at sea is no easy prize. Supplies dwindled, mutiny brewed, and a cunning first mate named Hargreaves plotted in the shadows. Kwame had broken his chains, but could he hold the wheel against hunger, betrayal, and the empire itself? This is not just a story of escape, it is the legend of a man who turned a vessel of slavery into an ark of vengeance, and the ocean will remember his name. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The stench hit Kwame first. Always the stench. Sweat and blood mixed with the sour reek of vomit in the pitch-black hold. His nose had long since learned to filter the worst of it. But some days, the smell grew so thick he could taste it. Around him, men lay pressed together in the darkness, their chains rattling with each roll of the ship. Kwame shifted carefully, feeling the iron bite into his wrists and ankles. The metal had rubbed his skin raw weeks ago, leaving wounds that never fully healed in the damp air. But physical pain was nothing new to a warrior. His mind drifted back to his village, to the sound of drums and the feeling of a spear balanced perfectly in his hands during training. He had been teaching the younger warriors when the raiders came. The memory came in flashes, shouting, smoke, the clash of steel. He had rallied his men, formed defensive lines just as he'd been taught, but the raiders had guns. The thunder of their weapons scattered his warriors, cut them down as they ran. Kwame had fought until a blow from behind sent him sprawling. He woke in chains. A sudden splash of water from above snapped him back to the present. The daily feeding had begun. Heavy boots thumped on the deck overhead, and weak light spilled down as the hatch creaked open. Kwame squinted up at the silhouette of the guard, memorizing his shape and movements as he had done every day. This one was Tucker, tall and thin, with a permanent sneer. He always carried the keys on his left hip. "Up, you dogs!" Tucker shouted, kicking at the nearest captive. "Time to eat what the captain's kind enough to give you." The guard tossed down hard biscuits and a bucket of brackish water. Men scrambled forward as far as their chains allowed, desperate for even these meager scraps. Those too weak to move got nothing. Kwame had seen too many waste away like that, their bodies eventually dragged up and thrown to the sharks. But Kwame made sure to move, to show just enough strength to get his share while never appearing threatening. He watched Tucker's every move through lowered eyes, noting how the man favored his right leg, how he always checked the chains closest to the door first. Knowledge was a weapon, his father had taught him. Even in chains, a warrior's mind stays sharp. The ship pitched suddenly, making Tucker stumble. A storm was brewing. Kwame could feel it in the way the timbers groaned around them. The guards grew careless during storms, more concerned with keeping the ship afloat than watching their cargo. "Filthy savages," Tucker muttered, regaining his balance. He cracked his whip at a man who had reached too far for water, leaving a bright line of blood across dark skin. The victim's scream joined the constant chorus of moans and prayers that filled the hold. Rain began drumming overhead, and the ship rolled harder. Tucker cursed and moved faster through his inspection, his keys jingling with each step. Kwame tracked the sound while pretending to focus on his meager meal. The storm grew stronger, waves crashing against the hull. Water began seeping through the deck above, dripping down on the captives. The hatch opened again, letting in the howl of wind and rain. "Tucker!" Another guard shouted down. "Captain needs all hands on deck! Storm's worse than we thought!" Tucker hurried toward the ladder, but not before delivering one final kick to the nearest prisoner. The hatch slammed shut behind him, plunging the hold back into darkness broken only by occasional flashes of lightning through the cracks. As thunder boomed overhead, Kwame's fingers found what he had noticed earlier, a loose iron nail jutting from one of the rotting deck boards near his position. The wood had been weakening for days, softened by constant moisture. Now the storm's violence had worked it free. When morning came, pale light filtered down through the hatch once more. The storm had passed, leaving the ship creaking in its wake. Kwame waited until he heard the familiar heavy tread of the morning guard approaching. Then, carefully positioning himself to block any view of his hands, he began testing the nail against his shackles. He timed each scrape of metal on metal with his coughs, a sound so common in the disease-ridden hold that none of the guards paid it any attention. The nail was crude, but strong. He could feel it catching on the lock mechanism. Years of weapons training had given him sensitive fingers. Even in darkness, they could read the shape of things. "Keep it quiet down there," the guard shouted, banging on the hatch. Kwame doubled over in another fit of coughing, using the movement to adjust his position. Around him, other captives stirred and moaned, providing more cover for his work. Some watched him with knowing eyes, hope kindling in their faces for the first time in weeks. They had seen his warrior's bearing, had whispered among themselves about his calm strength. Kwame kept working, each cough disguising another attempt at the lock. The nail caught, turned slightly. He could feel sweat running down his back despite the morning chill. One wrong move, one suspicious sound, and their chance would be lost. But a warrior's hands do not shake, even when everything depends on their steadiness. The morning light faded, leaving Kwame alone with his precious nail in the gloom. When the guards weren't watching, he dragged it against a rough stone that jutted from the ship's ballast, working slowly and deliberately. Each scrape brought a slightly sharper edge. His fingers, though numb from the chains, could feel the difference. Between guard checks, Kwame whispered to those chained nearby. "We are not cattle," he said, in their shared tongue. "We are warriors, farmers, craftsmen. Our chance will come." Some turned away, eyes vacant and spirits crushed by weeks of torment. But others lifted their heads, remembering who they had been before the chains. A woman's voice joined his, soft but clear. "He speaks truth," she said. "I am Abena, and I remember." She was chained several bodies away, but her words carried strength. "In my village, I taught the children our stories, our songs. They tried to silence us, but our voices remain." Kwame nodded gratefully. Her words gave shape to his hope, turning it from a desperate dream into something real. More captives stirred, sharing quiet words of their homes, their families, their lives before. Even those who had stopped speaking began to listen. The day dragged on, marked by the usual routines of meager meals and casual cruelty. Kwame kept working the nail whenever possible, though his fingers bled from the sharp edges. Abena led the others in barely whispered songs, their rhythm matching his work. The guards paid no attention. Singing was common enough in the hold, a sound they dismissed as mere animal noises. "My father taught me to read the stars," one man whispered. "I could guide a ship, if we had one." "I worked the forge," another added. "These chains? I know their weaknesses." More voices joined, each sharing some skill, some knowledge that might aid their freedom. Kwame listened carefully, building a map in his mind of what they could do, if only they had the chance. Abena's songs wove through it all, binding their whispers into something like hope. As evening approached, heavy footsteps stumbled above. The hatch creaked open, letting in the stink of rum along with the usual guard. Kwame recognized him. Wilson, the youngest of the crew, prone to drinking and showing off for his mates. Tonight, he was barely keeping his feet. "Time for inspection," Wilson slurred, swaying as he descended the ladder. His keys jangled loudly at his belt. Too many for just the hold, Kwame realized. He must have taken the master ring by mistake in his drunken state. Kwame caught Abina's eye. She nodded slightly and began a mournful song, one that had most of the captives swaying and humming. The movement masked Kwame's careful shift toward the ladder. He let his head loll, his body slump, as if overcome by the music and misery. Wilson kicked his way through the inspection, cursing at the noise. When he reached Kwame's seemingly unconscious form, he drew back his foot. "Wake up, dog!" The kick never landed. Kwame surged upward, as far as his chains allowed, throwing off Wilson's balance. The guard stumbled, trying to draw his whip. Kwame drove his shoulder into Wilson's legs, sending him sprawling. In the chaos, his sharpened nail found the keyring's clasp. "Filthy savage!" Wilson roared, recovering enough to rain blows down on Kwame's head and back. But Kwame had already passed the keys to the man beside him, who passed them on in turn. They vanished into the darkness of the hold as Wilson's boots found Kwame's ribs again and again. Other guards rushed down at Wilson's shouts. They dragged him away, still cursing and kicking. "Trying to attack me," he slurred. "Ought to throw him to the sharks." "You're drunk, Wilson," the lead guard growled. "Captain will hear about this. Back to your bunk before you do more damage." They left, taking Wilson with them. Kwame lay still, tasting blood, feeling new bruises bloom across his skin. But beneath the pain, a smile tugged at his lips. He heard the faint clink of metal being buried in the straw that passed for bedding in their floating prison. Abina's voice rose again, this time in a song of healing. Other voices joined, covering any sound of the keys changing hands until they reached their final hiding place. The metal disappeared beneath the moldy straw, but its presence changed everything. Hope had become more than a whisper. It had weight now, cold iron weight that promised liberation. Through the pain of his beating, Kwame felt a warrior's satisfaction. Every blow had been worth it. The keys were only the beginning, but they were proof that the chains could be broken. He let Abina's song wash over him, her voice carrying strength and comfort through the fetid air. Others took up her melody, adding harmonies that transformed the hold's usual chorus of misery into something different. Even those who had turned away before were humming now. The guards might hear only savage noise, but Kwame knew better. This was the sound of people remembering who they were, who they could be again. As night deepened, the singing faded to whispers, then to the usual sounds of restless sleep. But something had changed. The keys lay hidden, waiting for the right moment. And all through the hold, people who had been cargo were becoming warriors again, each in their own way. The storm hit with sudden fury. Thunder cracked overhead as waves slammed against the ship's hull. In the hold, Kwame felt each violent lurch and sway. The timber groaned around them, a sound like tortured screams. Water trickled through cracks, pooling in the filthy straw where they lay chained. "It's time," Kwame whispered in their shared tongue. His words passed from person to person, carried by urgent murmurs. Hands reached through darkness, passing the hidden key forward. Above, boots scrambled across the deck. Shouts pierced the howling wind. The ship pitched sharply, sending loose items crashing. Kwame heard the distinctive thud of bodies hitting wood as sailors lost their footing. The hatch flew open, letting in a spray of rain and sea foam. Lightning flashed, illuminating the worried face of young Cooper, the newest crew member. "Got to check the cargo ain't broke loose," he called up to someone. "Captain's orders!" Cooper descended halfway down the ladder, holding a swaying lantern. His eyes swept the hold, counting bodies, checking chains. The ship lurched again, He grabbed the ladder with both hands, cursing as his lantern clattered to the floor. This was their moment. Kwame gave a sharp whistle, the signal they'd practiced in whispers. The key emerged from hiding, passing swiftly from hand to hand. Those nearest the chains worked quickly, fingers fumbling with locks they couldn't see. Click, click, click. The sound of freedom, barely audible above the storm. Cooper noticed too late. "Hey, what are you—" His words cut off as a freed captive grabbed his legs, yanking him down. The ladder clattered away. Cooper's head struck the ballast with a wet crack. More chains fell away. Kwame felt the iron drop from his wrists, his ankles. His muscles, stiff from weeks of confinement, screamed as he rose. But pain was nothing now. Freedom burned in his blood, driving him forward. "Up!" he commanded. "Take anything you can use as a weapon." Broken boards, discarded tools, and their own chains became instruments of liberation. They surged toward the ladder like a wave of vengeance. Lightning split the sky again as the first freed captives reached the deck. Shouts of alarm turned to screams of terror. The storm's chaos worked in their favor. The crew was scattered, distracted, unprepared. Kwame emerged into stinging rain and howling wind. A sailor charged him, cutlass raised. Kwame ducked the wild swing and wrapped his chains around the man's throat. Weeks of rage poured through his arms as he pulled tight. The sailor's eyes bulged. His fingers clawed uselessly at the iron links. Then he went limp. All around, the revolt exploded into savage combat. Former captives wielded planks torn from the hold, shards of broken barrels, and their own chains. What they lacked in weapons, they made up for in numbers and desperate fury. Lightning flashed again, painting the scene in stark bursts. A sailor's head crushed by a length of wood, another pitched screaming over the rail, a third overwhelmed by 3 captives wielding chains like flails. "Keep fighting!" Kwame roared in their language, his voice carrying over the storm. "Take the ship!" He grabbed a fallen cutlass, its grip slick with rain and blood. The blade felt right in his hand, familiar as breathing. His warrior's training returned in a rush. 2 more sailors came at him. Kwame met the first with a slash that opened his gut. The second managed to graze Kwame's shoulder before a chain wrapped around his neck. Abina appeared from the darkness, her face fierce as she pulled the chain tight. The sailor dropped. "The captain!" someone shouted. "He's heading for the longboat!" Kwame spotted the captain through the rain, a tall figure in a sodden greatcoat, trying to lower a small boat. 3 sailors worked frantically beside him. Without the captain, the remaining crew would break. "With me!" Kwame called. A dozen freed captives followed as he charged across the pitching deck. The captain saw them coming and drew his pistol. The shot went wide, lost in the wind. Before he could reload, Kwame's cutlass took his hand. The captain's scream was lost in a crash of thunder. His sailors tried to fight, but were quickly overwhelmed. Chains that had once bound them now became instruments of justice. The captain and his men joined others in the churning sea. More sailors surrendered or fled into the water. Those who begged for mercy were bound with their own shackles. By the time the storm began to ease, half the crew lay dead on the bloodied deck. The rest huddled as prisoners, watching with terrified eyes as their former cargo became their captors. Kwame climbed to the quarterdeck, his clothes soaked with rain and blood. The ship's wheel stood before him, unattended. He gripped the smooth wood, feeling the vessel's power through his palms. The wheel moved easily under his hands, responding to his touch like a living thing. "We are free!" he shouted in their shared tongue. His voice carried across the deck, where dozens of his people stood breathing their first air of liberty. "The ship is ours!" A cheer went up, louder than the fading storm. Abina appeared beside him, her chains now a trophy across her shoulder. "Where will you take us?" she asked. Kwame turned the wheel slightly, feeling the ship respond. "Away from here," he said, "to a place where we make our own fate." He raised his bloodied hand high, letting all see. "Follow me to freedom!" More cheers erupted. Former captives took up positions around the deck, securing prisoners, tending to wounds, learning their new domain. The storm's last remnants swept away, revealing stars that had guided Kwame's people for generations. He stood at the wheel, rain-drenched but unbowed, knowing that this was only the beginning. Dawn would bring new challenges, but for now, the taste of freedom filled his lungs with each breath of salty air. Dawn broke over a deck still stained with yesterday's violence. Kwame stood at the ship's rail, watching his people embrace their first morning of freedom. The joy in their faces warmed him, yet worry gnawed at his gut. They had won the ship, but survival at sea would test them all. Abena approached, her face drawn with concern. "The water barrels in the hold," she said quietly. "Many are fouled or broken from the fighting. What remains won't last long." Kwame nodded grimly. "And the food stores? Salt pork, hard biscuits. Maybe enough for 2 weeks if we're careful. Less if we feed the prisoners, too." The prisoners. Kwame turned to where the surviving crew members sat bound against the mainmast. 8 men remained from the original crew of 25. Most were common sailors, terrified and subdued. But First Mate Hargreaves watched everything with calculating eyes, his bearing still proud despite his chains. "Gather everyone," Kwame ordered. "We must talk about what comes next." As his people assembled on deck, Kwame saw the divisions already forming. Some stood tall, savoring their power over the defeated crew. Others huddled in corners, overwhelmed by sudden freedom. Many bore wounds from the fighting, and all showed the marks of their captivity, raw skin from shackles, backs scarred by whips. "Listen well," Kwame called out in their shared tongue. "We have won this ship, but now we must survive upon it. Water and food are scarce. From today, everything must be rationed carefully." Murmurs of discontent rippled through the crowd. A man named Mensa stepped forward, chains still draped across his muscled shoulders. "Why should we accept small portions? We are free now. Let us feast on their stores while we can." Several others voiced agreement, but Kwame held firm. Free to starve at sea? Free to die of thirst? No. If we are truly free, we must be wise. Everyone will receive equal shares, even the prisoners. This sparked louder protests. "They deserve nothing," someone shouted. "Let them starve like they starved us. Feed them to the sharks." The crowd grew agitated, moving toward the bound sailors. Kwame stepped between them, arms raised. "Stop! We are not them. We will not become what we hate." "Then what do we do with them?" Abena asked, her voice cutting through the angry mutters. Kwame turned to the prisoners. "Bring the officers forward." 2 men were shoved to their knees before him, Hargreaves and the ship's carpenter, Morris. The carpenter trembled, but Hargreaves met Kwame's gaze steadily. "You know these waters," Kwame said to Hargreaves. "You know how to navigate by the stars, how to read the charts." "I do." Hargreaves's voice was calm, almost amused. "Planning to throw me overboard once I've taught you? We need your knowledge to survive. Help us reach safe harbor, and you'll live." A harsh laugh came from the crowd. "You trust this devil to guide us? He'll lead us straight to the Navy." Hargreaves smiled thinly. "The boy speaks truth. Why should you trust me? But consider this. I'm a practical man. I value my life above all else. Guide you to capture, and I'll swing from a yardarm same as you. Help you escape, and I might live to sail another day." Kwame studied him carefully. The man was cunning, dangerous, but his logic made sense. "What are your terms?" "Simple enough. My life and fair treatment. In return, I'll navigate this vessel wherever you choose. I'll even teach some of your people the basics of seamanship. You'll need that knowledge to survive." More protests erupted, but Kwame raised his hand for silence. "Agreed. But know this, betray us, and your death will be slow." The first mate nodded, accepting the terms with surprising grace. "Wise choice. Now, shall we discuss our heading? These waters are patrolled. We'll need to plot a careful course." Kwame ordered Hargreaves and Morris unchained, but kept under watch. The other sailors remained bound until they proved trustworthy. As the sun climbed higher, Hargreaves began instructing some of the stronger captives in basic sailing tasks, handling lines, trimming sails, watching for hazards. That evening, the freed people gathered around a small fire built in an iron pot on deck. They shared the first proper meal many had eaten in weeks, though the portions were small. Someone found an old drum in the captain's cabin, and soon the night air filled with rhythms from their homeland. Kwame watched them from the quarterdeck, singing, dancing, celebrating their liberation. The joy was real, yet fragile. He saw how they flinched at sudden movements, how their eyes kept darting to the darkness beyond the ship's lights. Freedom had come too suddenly, too violently. They were still learning how to live without chains. Abena joined him, offering a cup of water. "You're troubled. We won the ship," he said quietly. "But holding it, surviving, finding safe harbor, that will be harder than any battle. The men trust you. You led us to freedom." "Freedom?" Kwame gestured at the vast darkness surrounding them. "Look around. We're trapped on this floating piece of wood, with dwindling supplies and enemies all around. The sea itself could kill us, and our navigator." He glanced to where Hargreaves sat with Morris, speaking in low tones. "You think he plots against us?" "I think he plots always, but we need him." Kwame sipped the precious water. "For now, we have no choice but to trust him while watching him closely." Below deck, voices raised in songs of home. But they were far from home now, adrift in foreign waters. Kwame gripped the ship's rail, feeling the endless motion of the waves. They had seized their fate, but where would it carry them? Near the mainmast, hidden in shadow, Hargreaves leaned close to Morris. "The fool thinks he can play captain," he whispered. "But he'll learn. This ship will be ours again, soon enough." The morning sun beat down as Kwame stood at the ship's wheel, his hands gripping the smooth wood. Hargreaves stood beside him, pointing to the compass mounted before them. "Keep her steady on this heading," Hargreaves instructed, his voice carrying the weary patience of a teacher with a slow student. "When the needle wavers, adjust gently. Too much force, and you'll have us zigzagging across the Atlantic." Kwame's muscles tensed as the wheel tried to fight his grip. The sea never rested, constantly pushing against the rudder. "How do you know which way leads to safety?" "The sun tells us east from west," Hargreaves explained, gesturing to the morning light. "The stars guide us north and south. Charts show the passages between islands. But the wind and currents, those you must feel in your bones." Throughout the morning, Kwame watched and learned. His warrior's discipline served him well, memorizing the names of sails and lines, understanding how each affected the ship's motion. But more than the technical lessons, he studied Hargreaves himself. The man's subtle expressions, his careful choice of words, the way his eyes constantly scanned the horizon. Below on the main deck, the surviving crew labored under guard. Kwame had ordered them to scrub the planks, carry water barrels, mend torn sails, the same back-breaking work they'd once forced upon their captives. Some accepted their fate quietly, but others seethed with barely contained rage. Abena approached the quarterdeck, her face troubled. "The men grow restless," she said softly in their native tongue. "They want more than just putting the crew to work. They want blood for their suffering." Kwame nodded grimly. He'd seen the hatred in their eyes, the way some fingered their newly acquired knives while watching the sailors. "Bring everyone to the main deck," he ordered. It's time they saw justice done properly. When the people gathered, Kwame had the guards bring forward a sailor named Jenkins, a man known for his particular cruelty during the voyage. Jenkins had taken pleasure in denying water to the dying, in wielding the whip with extra force. "This man caused great suffering," Kwame announced, his voice carrying across the deck. "What should be his punishment?" "Death!" came several shouts. "Make him bleed?" Jenkins trembled, his face pale with fear. But Kwame raised his hand for silence. "Death is quick," he said. "Gone in a moment. I say, let him live. Live to serve as we served, to feel the weight of his crimes with each passing day." He turned to Jenkins. "You will clean this ship from bow to stern, every splinter, every stain. When you finish, you'll start again. Your hands will bleed as ours did. But you will live as long as you work well." Some muttered in disappointment, wanting harsher punishment. But others nodded, seeing the justice in making their former tormentors experience their own cruelty. Jenkins was handed a brush and bucket, and under the watch of armed guards, began scrubbing the deck as jeers and insults rained down. "See how he crawls like a dog," someone shouted. "Not so mighty now, are you?" Kwame let them vent their anger through words rather than violence. It was a release valve, bleeding off some of the hatred that could tear them apart. Yet he saw some turn away in disgust, wanting more brutal vengeance. Through the day, Kwame divided his time between learning navigation and maintaining order. He set up work rotations, ensuring everyone contributed to running the ship. Those with any sailing knowledge, however slight, were paired with others to share their skills. The vessel slowly transformed from a prison into a community, though a fragile one. Hargreaves watched it all with calculating eyes, offering advice that seemed helpful, yet somehow left Kwame uneasy. "You're learning quickly," the first mate said as evening approached. "But remember, a ship needs firm discipline. These people may be free, but they must still obey their captain without question." "They are not slaves to be commanded," Kwame replied sharply. "They follow because they choose to." "For now," Hargreaves murmured. "But when food grows scarcer, when tempers fray, we'll see how long choice lasts." Before Kwame could respond, a shout came from the crow's nest. "Land! Land to the west!" Everyone rushed to the railings. On the horizon, barely visible through the haze, dark shapes rose from the sea, the first hints of the Caribbean islands. A cheer went up from the freed people, hope kindling in their eyes. Kwame felt it too, the first real promise that their desperate gamble might succeed. But he also saw Hargreaves's slight smile, and wondered what schemes lurked behind those calculating eyes. As the sun began to set, bringing welcome relief from the heat, the mood on ship lifted. People spoke of reaching land, of finding others who had won their freedom, of building new lives. The evening meal, though still carefully rationed, felt almost like a celebration. Workers came off their shifts, sweating but proud, having mastered new skills. Even the former crew worked with less resistance, perhaps seeing that fair treatment would continue as long as they cooperated. The ship cut smoothly through darkening waters, guided by stars beginning to scatter across the purple sky. Looking at his people's faces lit by hope, Kwame allowed himself to feel a moment of pride. They had maintained their humanity, despite all that had been done to them. They had chosen justice over pure vengeance. Perhaps they could forge something new from their hard-won freedom after all. The stars emerged one by one as darkness settled over the ship. Most of the freed people had found places to rest, exhausted from the day's labors. But Kwame remained awake, standing at the ship's rail with Abena beside him. The gentle splash of waves against the hull provided a soothing rhythm to their quiet conversation. "What do you see when you think of freedom?" Abena asked, her voice soft but clear in the night air. Kwame considered before answering. "I see houses built by our own hands, gardens growing food we choose to plant, children playing without fear." He paused, looking out at the starlit water. But most of all, I see us building something new, not just escaping the old. Tell me more, Abena encouraged, drawing closer to hear his words above the sea breeze. In my homeland, I was a warrior. I protected my people, yes, but I also saw how villages worked together during harvest, how elders taught the young our stories and customs. His eyes took on a distant look. We could build such a place again. Not just a hiding spot, but a true settlement where we govern ourselves. Abena nodded eagerly. We could teach the children both new and old ways, songs from home, but also reading and numbers, everything the white men tried to keep from us. She hummed a few notes of a familiar melody. Music kept hope alive in the hold. It can help build our new home, too. And those who wish to learn trades could, Kwame began, but a harsh laugh cut him off. Planning your paradise already? Hargreaves emerged from the shadows, his voice dripping with mockery. How charming. And where exactly do you think you'll build this magical settlement? The Caribbean islands are crawling with British patrols, Spanish soldiers, French Marines. There are places they don't look, Abena replied firmly. Hidden coves, forgotten valleys. We've heard stories of others who found freedom. Ah, yes, the maroon colonies. Hargreaves sneered as he checked their heading. Ragged bands of fugitives scratching out survival in the jungle. Is that your grand vision? Hiding like animals until fever or hunger claims you? Before Kwame could respond, shouts erupted from the main deck. Two of the freed men, brothers named Kofi and Kuntu, had cornered one of the sailors against the mast. Their fists were raised, rage evident in their stance. "You work the whip," Kofi accused. "I remember your face." Kwame rushed down from the quarterdeck, Abena close behind. He reached the scene just as Kuntu landed a solid punch to the sailor's jaw. "Stop!" Kwame's voice cracked like thunder. The brothers froze, turning to face him. "We decided. No unauthorized violence against the crew." "But he deserves," Kuntu began. "He deserves much," Kwame cut him off. "But we are not animals acting on impulse. We are free people building a new way." He stared hard at the brothers. "Or do you wish to return to the law of the lash?" The gathered crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others looking unsatisfied. The sailor slumped against the mast, blood trickling from his split lip. "3 extra shifts of deck duty," Kwame pronounced to the brothers. "Working alongside the man you attacked, you'll learn to control your anger, or you'll learn how it feels to labor with bruised knuckles." It was a light punishment compared to what they'd once suffered, but the principle mattered. The brothers accepted their sentence with stiff nods, though resentment still smoldered in their eyes. As the crowd dispersed, Abena began to sing softly, a work song from their homeland about enduring hardship together. Others joined in, their voices gaining strength. Even those who didn't know the words hummed along. Someone produced a small drum fashioned from a wooden bucket, tapping out the rhythm. Another found a crate of ship's biscuits, hard, dry crackers that were standard sailors' fare. These were shared around, each person taking only a small portion, despite their hunger. The simple food and familiar music worked a kind of magic. Tensions eased as people settled in groups, some telling stories, others teaching sailing knots to newcomers. A few children who had survived the hold played a quiet game with pebbles. Kwame watched it all from the quarterdeck, sensing a subtle shift. They were no longer just escapees thrown together by circumstance. They were becoming a community, however fragile. Near midnight, most had found places to sleep. A skeleton crew kept watch, with trusted guards ensuring the remaining sailors stayed in their designated area. The sea remained calm, stars reflecting off the gentle swells. Abena appeared at Kwame's side again, offering him a small piece of saved biscuit. "They're beginning to believe," she said, "not just in escape, but in building something lasting." "If we can hold together," Kwame replied, "keep the balance between justice and mercy." "You did well with the brothers today," she observed. "Firm, but fair. It reminds them we're not replacing one tyranny with another." They stood in comfortable silence, listening to the creaking of timber and rope, the whisper of sails, the soft breathing of sleepers below. Despite Hargreaves's mockery, their dreams of freedom felt solid and real in the quiet night. Kwame's hand found the ship's rail, gripping it as he gazed toward the horizon where land waited. "We are almost free," he whispered, the words carrying all his hope and determination. Abena's fingers brushed his arm gently. "We were free the moment we chose to rise up," she replied. "Everything since then has been proving we deserve it." The night wrapped around them like a protective cloak, stars wheeling overhead as the ship carried its precious cargo of dreams toward the promise of dawn. Dawn broke harsh and bright over choppy waters. Quam's peaceful night dissolved into chaos when urgent shouts rang across the deck. "The rudder won't turn," a freed man named Yao called from the wheel. "Something's wrong." Kwame rushed to the helm, muscles tensing as he gripped the wooden spokes. The wheel turned, but the ship maintained its course, unresponsive to commands. His heart sank as understanding dawned. This was no accident. "Get Hargreaves," he ordered, watching two men hurry below deck. They returned moments later with the first mate, who wore an expression of practiced concern. "What seems to be the trouble?" Hargreaves asked, his voice smooth as oil. "The rudder. It won't respond." Kwame's eyes bore into the sailor. "You checked it yourself yesterday. Said all was well." Hargreaves made a show of examining the wheel, then peered over the stern. "Ah, I see the problem. The linkage must have come loose. Simple enough to fix, but we'll need to slow the ship and send someone over the side." "In these waters?" Abena stepped forward, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Where British patrols are known to sail." A murmur rippled through the gathering crowd. Kwame noticed how Hargreaves's eyes flicked toward the horizon before answering. "The sea is calm enough. Unless you'd prefer to drift helplessly?" The first mate spread his hands in a gesture of innocence that fooled no one. "Check him," Kwame commanded. Two men grabbed Hargreaves's arms while another searched his pockets. They found nothing, but the sailor's smirk told its own story. "You did this," Kwame said quietly, "while on night watch. That's why you volunteered for the extra shift?" "Prove it," Hargreaves spat back. "You need me. Without my knowledge, you're all just lost children playing at sailing." The crowd pressed closer, anger building. Kwame felt the familiar push of vengeance against his resolve to maintain order. Before he could decide Hargreaves's fate, a cry came from the crow's nest. "Sails! White sails to the northeast!" All eyes turned to the horizon. There, catching the morning sun, were the unmistakable white sails of a British naval cutter. The vessel cut through the waves with purpose, its course aligned perfectly to intercept them. "How long?" Kwame demanded. "An hour, maybe less, with this wind," the lookout called back. Hargreaves laughed then, a sound of pure satisfaction. "Did you really think you could just sail away to freedom? That the British Empire would let valuable cargo escape?" Fury exploded among the freed people. Several lunged for Hargreaves, but Kwame's voice cut through the chaos. "Hold!" he commanded. "Bind him securely, but keep him alive. We still need his knowledge." As men tied Hargreaves with rope, Kwame turned to Abena. "Get everyone armed, tools, broken spars, anything that can serve as a weapon. And find me that sailor who worked as a gunner." The deck erupted into frantic activity. People ran below, returning with makeshift weapons, kitchen knives, wooden clubs, lengths of chain. The former gunner, a weathered man named Marco, confirmed the ship's cannons were loaded, but explained they were badly outgunned by a naval cutter. Kwame organized defensive positions, placing the strongest fighters near likely boarding points. He sent the children and those too weak to fight into the relative safety of the lower deck. Every minute, the cutter grew larger on the horizon. "We could surrender!" Hargreaves called from where he sat bound. "They might show mercy if you give up peacefully." "Like the mercy shown in the hold?" Abena shot back. "We choose death on our feet over chains on our knees." Kwame studied the approaching vessel through a spyglass. Its gun ports were open, cannon muzzles visible. The naval flag flew proud. This was no merchant ship to be scared off. These were trained soldiers coming to crush their bid for freedom. "If we can't turn," Kwame announced, "we fight. But not like cornered animals. We fight with purpose." He began issuing rapid orders, positioning people behind barricades of cargo and barrels. The cutter was close enough now to see its crew scurrying across the deck, preparing for battle. Kwame had seen such ships before, watching from the coast of his homeland as they patrolled for slavers, or so they claimed. In truth, they cared little for stopping the trade, only for ensuring the British crown got its share. "Remember what we fight for," he called to his people. "Not just our lives, but our freedom, our future, the dreams we shared last night. They are worth dying for, but better worth living for. So fight smart. Fight together." Abena organized the women, positioning them with buckets of water to fight fires from cannon shot. Others stood ready with patches and plugs to seal holes near the water line. Every person had a role, a purpose. "They mean to make an example of us," Kwame continued, his voice carrying across the deck, "to show other captives that resistance brings only death. Shall we prove them wrong?" "Yes," came the cry from dozens of throats. The distance closed. The cutter's captain raised a speaking trumpet. His words carried on the wind. "Heave to, and prepare to be boarded. Resist, and we will show no quarter." Kwame's only response was to order the ship's flag struck down. Let them think the freed people were surrendering. Let them come close. The morning sun climbed higher as the two ships drew near. Sweat beaded on faces both determined and afraid. Prayers in a dozen languages whispered across the deck. The first cannon shot from the cutter was a warning, splashing into the water off their bow. The second was not. It slammed into the ship's side with a terrible crack, sending splinters of wood flying and people scrambling for cover. "Hold fast!" Kwame shouted above the chaos. "Hold together!" More cannon fire thundered across the waves. Wood splintered, and thick smoke began to fill the air. Through the gun smoke, grappling hooks arced across the narrowing gap between ships. The heavy iron claws bit into the railings with dull thuds. British Marines in their red coats began swinging across, muskets slung across their backs. "Now!" Kwame bellowed. His people burst from their hiding places. They cut several grappling lines, sending soldiers plunging into the churning sea. But more hooks flew. More Marines swung across, and now the air crackled with musket fire. The deck became a chaos of close combat. Former captives wielding makeshift weapons clashed with disciplined soldiers carrying bayonets. Blood sprayed across salt-stained planks. Screams and gunshots echoed across the waves. Kwame fought like the warrior he once was, his improvised clubs smashing into Marine after Marine. But for every soldier they struck down, two more seemed to take his place. The British officers directed their men with practiced efficiency, slowly establishing footholds on the deck. "Keep them from the hatches," Kwame shouted, trying to prevent the soldiers from reaching those hidden below. He saw Abena rallying a group of women armed with kitchen knives, fighting with desperate courage. Then came the sound that would haunt his nightmares, the sharp crack of a musket, followed by Abena's sudden gasp. She stumbled, a red stain spreading across her chest, her eyes wide with surprise. As she fell, the women around her faltered. "No!" Kwame fought to reach her, but Marines pressed between them. He watched helplessly as Abena slumped to the deck, her blood mixing with the spray of waves. The sight of her fall seemed to break something in the freed people's resistance. Fear replaced fury in their eyes. Some threw down their weapons, Others fought on, but with diminished spirit. The disciplined volleys of British musket fire cut through their ranks with terrible efficiency. "Take him alive!" a British officer pointed at Kwame. "He's their leader." Kwame fought on, his club becoming slick with blood. He struck down 2 more Marines before a musket ball tore through his shoulder. The impact spun him around, and before he could recover, 3 soldiers tackled him to the deck. Cold iron closed around his wrists once more, the familiar bite of shackles he had so recently escaped. The soldiers dragged him up roughly, forcing him to kneel before the British captain. Hargreaves appeared, now freed from his bonds, straightening his coat with exaggerated care. "I told you they were nothing but savage cargo, Captain, animals who needed to be reminded of their place." The British captain nodded curtly. "Secure the ship. Shoot anyone who continues to resist. The rest will fetch a fine price in Kingston." Kwame watched in helpless rage as his people were rounded up. Some were shot where they stood for refusing to surrender. Others were beaten into submission, their brief taste of freedom ending in brutal defeat. The deck was littered with bodies, freed people who had dared to dream of a future without chains. Marines efficiently began transferring survivors back into the hold, accompanied by the crack of whips and cruel laughter. Hargreaves personally supervised, taking obvious pleasure in restoration of the old order. "I warned you," Hargreaves said, pausing before Kwame. "Did you truly think a handful of slaves could outfight the British Navy? Your ignorance would be amusing if it hadn't cost so many lives." He kicked Abina's lifeless body. "Such a waste of valuable property." Kwame lunged against his chains, earning a rifle butt to the stomach that doubled him over. They forced him back down, face pressed against the bloody deck. The British captain gave brisk orders to prepare a towing line. Soon both ships would make for Kingston, where Kwame and his surviving people would face either the gallows or the auction block. Likely the latter, given the value of their lives as property. More chains were added to Kwame's restraints. They weren't taking any chances with him. He could taste blood in his mouth, feel it running down his shoulder where the musket ball had struck. Around him lay the broken bodies of those who had dared to follow him toward freedom. The sky darkened overhead as soldiers continued securing the ship. Kwame closed his eyes, the weight of failure crushing his spirit more thoroughly than any chains. He thought of Abina's gentle strength, now stilled forever. Of the children below deck, who would grow up knowing only bondage. Of all the dreams of freedom drowning in blood on these salt-stained planks. Hargreaves directed sailors to begin transferring supplies from the captured ship to the cutter. The British captain was eager to make port before news of the uprising could spread. Examples would need to be made. A Marine sergeant began questioning the surviving crew about the uprising's leaders. Names were given, marked down in a ledger for later punishment. The systematic efficiency of it all, the casual way they reasserted control, spoke to how routine such brutality had become. Kwame felt consciousness slipping away as blood loss and exhaustion took their toll. The last thing he saw was Hargreaves standing at the wheel, restored to his former authority, giving orders as if the brief revolution had been nothing but an unpleasant dream. The voices around him grew distant. The pain in his shoulder faded to a dull throb. Even the bitter taste of defeat seemed to recede as darkness crept in at the edges of his vision. Far above, thunder rolled across steel-gray clouds. A cool wind began to blow, carrying the promise of rain. But Kwame noticed none of it as his eyes finally closed, convinced that this defeat marked the end of not just his dream of freedom, but of all hope itself. The first drops of rain struck Kwame's face like tiny needles, rousing him from his half-conscious state. Thunder boomed overhead, closer now, and the ship began to pitch violently in the growing swells. Through blurred vision, he watched British Marines stumble across the deck, their precise formations broken by the rolling motion. "Secure those lines!" someone shouted as the wind rose to a howl. The British cutter, still lashed alongside, groaned against its moorings. Waves crashed over both vessels, sending spray across the blood-stained planks. Kwame tested his chains, feeling the weakness where they'd been hastily attached. His shoulder burned from the musket wound, but the cold rain helped clear his mind. He noticed how the guards were more focused on the worsening storm than their prisoners. Nature itself seemed to rage against their cruelty. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the deck in harsh white flashes. In those strobing moments, Kwame saw his chance. The chain binding his legs had a damaged link, weakened from where it had been cut, and reattached. Each roll of the ship put stress on that spot. "All hands!" the British captain bellowed, as the wind grew fiercer. "Cut us loose from the prize before—" His words were drowned by an explosive crack of thunder. The storm hit with full force, sending walls of water crashing over both ships. Marines who had been so confident with their muskets now clung to whatever they could grab. Kwame braced his legs and pulled hard against the weak link. Pain lanced through his wounded shoulder, but he ground his teeth and kept pulling. The chain grew taut with each roll of the ship, metal straining against metal. A massive wave lifted the cutter higher than the slave ship. For a moment, the two vessels pulled apart, putting enormous strain on every line connecting them. Kwame's chain snapped with a sharp ping that was lost in the howling wind. He moved fast, keeping low. The rain had become a solid sheet of water, reducing visibility to mere feet. Using his freed legs, he kicked out at the nearest guard, sending the man sprawling. Kwame grabbed the fallen Marine's knife and began sawing at his remaining restraints. "The prisoners!" someone shouted, but the warning was swept away by the storm. Free at last, Kwame scrambled toward the hold where his people were locked away. He found the guard fumbling with keys, trying to keep his balance. One quick thrust of the stolen knife, and Kwame had the keys in his hands. "Rise!" he shouted as he threw open the hatch. "Rise and fight!" Lightning revealed the faces below, beaten but not broken. They surged upward like a wave themselves, spilling onto the deck where the storm had created chaos. The British soldiers, so formidable in calm weather, now struggled just to stay upright. Another massive swell lifted the cutter. Lines snapped with sounds like gunshots. The two ships ground against each other, wood splintering and men screaming. Kwame led his people across the heaving deck, attacking the disoriented Marines with desperate fury. "Cut them down!" Hargreaves appeared through the rain, trying to rally the soldiers. "Don't let them!" A blinding flash of lightning struck the cutter's mainmast. The massive wooden spar exploded, sending burning splinters in all directions. What remained of the mast toppled with agonizing slowness, pulling taut the remaining lines between the ships. "Cut us loose!" the British captain screamed, but it was too late. The falling mast dragged both vessels together. Men on the cutter abandoned their posts, leaping for the relative safety of the slave ship. Others weren't fast enough, swept into the churning sea as the cutter began to break apart. Kwame fought through the chaos, his stolen knife finding British flesh again and again. His people fought beside him, their chains becoming weapons. The storm's fury matched their own, nature's judgment against those who would enslave them. The cutter's bow suddenly dipped, its stern rising as it began to sink. The few remaining lines between the ships snapped violently. Soldiers who had been so eager to board now found themselves trapped on the wrong vessel, facing the vengeful fury of those they'd tried to re-enslave. "Form up!" Hargreaves shouted, trying to organize a defense. "Rally to me!" But there was no fighting the combined fury of storm and freedom. Marines were overwhelmed, driven back by sheer numbers. Some threw down their weapons and begged for mercy. Others fought to the end, their bodies joining those of their victims in the bloodied rainwater washing across the deck. Through it all, Kwame drove forward. His wound bled freely, but he barely felt it. The rain seemed to give him strength, washing away the taste of defeat. He saw Hargreaves backing away, drawing a sword as his carefully maintained order collapsed around him. Behind them, the British cutter gave a final groan and slipped beneath the waves. Lightning continued to flash, thunder shaking the very planks beneath their feet. The storm raged on, but Kwame's ship was pulling away from the wreckage, riding high despite the waves. "You're nothing but property," Hargreaves snarled, his fine clothes now soaked and torn. "You'll always be nothing but—" Kwame charged through the rain, his knife ready. Hargreaves raised his sword, rain streaming down its polished blade. They faced each other on the pitching deck, surrounded by the chaos of battle and storm. The two men began to circle, each seeking advantage on the slick planks. Lightning flashed again, reflecting in their eyes. One man fighting to maintain his power, the other to ensure it would never chain him again. Hargreaves slashed with his sword, the blade whistling through the rain. Kwame dodged backward, his feet sliding on the wet deck. The wound in his shoulder screamed with every movement, but adrenaline kept him going. Around them, the battle continued to rage between survivors and soldiers. "You're skilled with a blade," Hargreaves sneered, pressing forward with another strike. "But you're still just a savage playing at being free." Kwame didn't waste breath responding. He knew Hargreaves wanted to make him angry, to make him reckless. Instead, he watched the first mate's footwork, noting how the man struggled to maintain balance on the rolling deck. Years at sea had taught Hargreaves to walk on shifting planks, but the storm's violence challenged even his experience. Lightning flashed again, followed instantly by deafening thunder. Kwame used the sound to mask his sudden lunge, his knife darting toward Hargreaves's chest. The first mate parried, but barely. His fine boots slipped slightly on the wet wood. "You think you can lead these people?" Hargreaves spat water from his face. "You'll all die at sea if the Navy doesn't hang you first." They circled each other, trading feints and strikes. Kwame's knife was shorter, forcing him to get closer to attack. But Hargreaves's longer sword was harder to control in the wind and rain. Neither man could gain a clear advantage. A massive wave crashed over the starboard rail, nearly knocking them both down. Kwame rolled with the water's force, coming up in a crouch. His eyes caught something half-buried in the wash of seawater, a length of chain, torn loose from its mounting by the storm's fury. Hargreaves charged, seeing Kwame's distraction as an opportunity. The sword thrust forward like a silver snake in the rain. Kwame twisted aside, feeling the blade slice through his shirt. He grabbed the chain with his free hand, its familiar weight both terrible and comforting. "Still drawn to your chains?" Hargreaves laughed, readying another attack. "Perhaps you miss." Kwame whipped the chain upward, its links catching the sword's crossguard. He yanked hard, pulling Hargreaves off balance. The first mate stumbled forward, his perfect stance broken. Kwame's knife slashed across his sword arm, drawing first blood. Hargreaves cursed and switched his sword to his left hand. He was clearly less skilled with it, but still dangerous. "I should have had you flogged when I had the chance," he snarled. "You had your chance," Kwame replied, his voice cold as the rain. "Now, it's gone." They crashed together again, blade meeting blade in a spray of water. Kwame let his knife be knocked aside, seemingly disarmed. But as Hargreaves pressed forward for the kill, Kwame swung the chain in a wide arc. It wrapped around the first mate's sword arm, pinning it. Hargreaves tried to pull free, but Kwame had learned the cruel art of chains from the receiving end. He knew exactly how to tighten them, how to use an opponent's own struggle against them. The more Hargreaves pulled, the deeper the links bit into his flesh. "You're not the only one who learned during our voyage," Kwame said, drawing the chain tighter. Hargreaves dropped his sword, trying to claw at the chain with his free hand. But Kwame had already started his next move, swinging the loose end of the chain around the first mate's throat. The very links that had once bound him in the hold now became his weapon of liberation. "These were yours to bind me," Kwame growled, pulling the chain tight as Hargreaves gasped for air. "Now they free me." The first mate's face turned purple, his eyes bulging. His perfectly maintained uniform was soaked and torn, his authority meaningless against cold iron and determined strength. He tried to speak, but only managed a choking gurgle. Kwame pulled harder, muscles straining. All the months of pain and humiliation, all the deaths he'd witnessed in the hold, all the cruelty Hargreaves had overseen, it all poured through him into the chain. The first mate's struggles grew weaker, his fingers clawing uselessly at his throat. "Watch," Kwame commanded, as other fighters paused to witness the scene. "Watch power break." With a final surge of strength, he twisted the chain. Hargreaves's neck snapped with a sound lost in the storm's roar. The first mate collapsed, his body twitching once before going still in the pooled rainwater. Kwame unwound the chain from the corpse, holding it high above his head. Lightning split the sky at that exact moment, illuminating him in harsh white light. The chain gleamed in his grip, transformed from a symbol of bondage to one of victory. "We are free!" he roared, his voice carrying over wind and thunder. "Free!" The surviving captives took up the cry, their shouts drowning out even the storm. The remaining British soldiers, seeing their leadership destroyed, threw down their weapons. Some begged for mercy, while others simply stood in shocked silence. Kwame lowered the chain, letting its end drag across the deck. The rain began to slacken, the wind's howl diminishing to a low moan. Nature's fury, having served its purpose, started to recede. Waves that had towered over the ship now merely rocked it, growing calmer with each pass. Around them, wreckage from the destroyed cutter bobbed in the gray waters. Broken spars, shattered planks, and torn canvas spread out in every direction. Here and there, bodies floated face down, their uniforms marking them as British sailors. The sea had claimed its price for their freedom. The storm continued to weaken, its dark clouds breaking apart overhead. A few stars peeked through gaps in the celestial canopy, their light reflecting off the calming waters. The ship, though battered, rode high in the swells, carrying its cargo of newly secured liberty across the vast Atlantic. Dawn crept across the ocean like a tired soldier, revealing the full scope of the night's carnage. The morning light painted the waters in shades of pink and gold, a beautiful contrast to the wreckage scattered across the waves. Kwame stood at the ship's rail, his hands still bearing the marks of chains and combat, surveying what remained of their violent liberation. The slave ship, though damaged, had weathered the storm better than the British cutter. Torn sails hung like tattered banners from the masts, and splintered wood marked where cannon fire had struck. But the hull remained sound, and the deck, though stained with blood, still carried them above the waves. Bodies floated in the gentle swells, British soldiers, sailors, and freed captives alike. The sea made no distinction between them now. Kwame watched as some of the survivors used long poles to push the dead away from the ship's sides, preventing them from becoming tangled in the rudder. "We should say words for them," came a quiet voice behind him. One of the older men, his face lined with years of hardship, gestured to their fallen companions. "They died free. They deserve to be remembered." Kwame nodded slowly. "Gather everyone who can walk. We'll honor them properly." The survivors assembled on the main deck, perhaps 40 people in all. Some nursed wounds, others simply stared vacant-eyed at the horizon, still processing their hard-won freedom. They formed a rough circle, supporting those too weak to stand alone. In the center of the group, Kwame knelt beside Abena's body. Someone had covered her with a piece of sailcloth, but her face remained visible, peaceful despite the violence of her death. Her loss cut deeper than his physical wounds. She had been their heart, their voice of compassion when rage threatened to consume them. Abena saw hope when we could not, Kwame began, his voice carrying across the quiet deck. She sang in the darkness of the hold. She tended our wounds. She reminded us that freedom meant more than just broken chains. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Many wiped tears from their eyes, remembering her kindness during their darkest moments. And she was not alone, Kwame continued, rising to his feet. Each person we lost carried dreams of liberty. They died not as slaves, but as warriors, as free people. He touched the chain still wrapped around his waist, Hargreaves's chain, now a symbol of triumph rather than bondage. Their sacrifice will never be forgotten. The survivors began to sing, a low, mournful melody that Abena had often led them in. The song spoke of home, of return, of spirits crossing great waters to find peace. As they sang, they carefully lifted their dead companions, sliding them into the sea with gentle reverence. Kwame watched each body disappear beneath the waves, committing their faces to memory. These were not just casualties of a battle. They were the price of freedom, souls who had dared to grasp liberty even at the cost of their lives. When the last body had been committed to the deep, Kwame moved to the ship's wheel. The wooden handles were smooth from years of use, worn by the hands of men who had once commanded their fate. Now it responded to his touch, a tangible symbol of their changed circumstances. "Check our supplies," he ordered, his voice carrying the weight of command. "Food, water, anything useful. And find me someone who can work with canvas. We need those sails repaired." The survivors moved with purpose, some descending into the hold that had once imprisoned them, others climbing the rigging to assess damage aloft. The work helped focus their minds, keeping grief at bay through necessary action. A young man who had served as lookout during the night approached Kwame. "There's land out there," he reported, pointing to the west. "Far off, but I've seen birds flying that direction. Where they go, islands follow." Kwame squinted at the horizon. The morning haze made it difficult to distinguish sea from sky, but he trusted the lookout's eyes. "The Caribbean," he said, remembering Hargreaves's charts. "There are places there, hidden places where people like us have found refuge." The news spread quickly among the survivors, igniting small sparks of hope in eyes that had seen too much darkness. They worked with renewed energy, patching sails with borrowed canvas, securing loose rigging, making their vessel seaworthy again. Near midday, Kwame gathered them once more. The sun had dried the blood from the deck, and the sea breeze carried away the last lingering sense of gunpowder and death. He looked at their faces, marked by suffering but unbroken, scarred but alive. "We are free," he declared, his voice strong and clear. "Free to choose our path, free to build new lives. The dead we leave behind light our way forward. Their courage flows in our blood. Their dreams live in our hearts." A woman raised her voice in song, another of Abena's melodies, but this one spoke of victory rather than sorrow. Others joined in, the harmony growing stronger with each voice. The sound carried across the waves, a declaration of life and liberty to the endless horizon. Kwame turned the wheel slightly, adjusting their course toward the distant promise of land. The ship responded sluggishly with its damaged sails, but it moved with steady purpose through the calm seas. Every mile carried them further from their chains, closer to a future they could shape with their own hands. The sun climbed higher, burning away the morning mist. Those not occupied with repairs gathered at the rails, watching for any sign of shore. They shared small rations of ship's biscuit and water, each bite and sip tasting sweeter for being taken in freedom. The lookout's sharp eyes constantly scanned the horizon, searching for both sanctuary and threat. They were still vulnerable, still hunted, but no longer helpless. Every person aboard had proven they would fight for their liberty, would die before accepting chains again. As the battered ship approached the hidden cove, thick jungle vegetation parted to reveal a natural harbor, sheltered from prying eyes by towering cliffs. The morning sun painted everything in soft golden light, turning the peaceful waters into liquid amber. Kwame stood at the wheel, his hands steady despite his exhaustion, guiding their vessel through the narrow entrance. Movement caught his eye, figures emerging from the tree line, their dark skin blending with the shadows of the forest. At first, some of the survivors tensed, reaching for makeshift weapons, but Kwame raised his hand. These were not soldiers or slavers. These people moved with the confidence of those who knew freedom. "They're like us," he called out, his voice carrying across the deck. "Look at how they stand, unbound, unafraid." As the ship drew closer to shore, more people appeared from the jungle, women carrying baskets, men with fishing spears, children darting between the trees. They gathered at the water's edge, watching the approaching vessel with mixture of caution and curiosity. One of the survivors, an elderly man who had survived the battle, suddenly called out in a language Kwame didn't understand. A response came immediately from shore, excited shouts and gestures of welcome. The old man turned to Kwame with tears in his eyes. "They are Maroons," he explained, his voice trembling. "Escaped slaves who built their own world here. I heard stories of such places, but never dared believe." The ship eased into the shallow waters of the cove. Several of the Maroons waded out to help guide them to the best anchoring spot, calling instructions in a mixture of languages. Their eyes widened at the sight of the vessel. They knew well what this ship had been, what it represented. As soon as the anchor dropped, small boats pushed out from shore. The Maroons moved with practiced efficiency, helping the wounded and exhausted survivors from the ship. There were tears and embraces as people stepped onto solid ground for the first time in months. Many fell to their knees, touching the earth as if to convince themselves it was real. An elderly woman, her hair white with age but her back straight and proud, approached Kwame as he finally left the ship. She wore a colorful head wrap and carried herself with the dignity of a leader. Without words, she opened her arms to him. Kwame stepped into her embrace, feeling the strength in her thin frame. "Welcome home, warrior," she said in heavily accented English. "We have watched many ships pass our shores, carrying our people in chains, but you turned their weapon against them." The survivors were led to a clearing just beyond the beach. Cooking fires already burned, and the smell of food drew hungry faces toward the flames. Children darted among the newcomers, offering water and fruit, while others brought clean clothes and medical supplies. "This settlement," the elder woman explained as she walked with Kwame, "has existed for 30 years. We take in those who break their chains, teach them to live free again. Some stay, some go on to build new homes elsewhere, but all find healing here." Kwame watched as his people were absorbed into the community. The Maroons moved with practiced ease, knowing exactly what these survivors needed, not just physical care, but the gentle touch of kindness, the patient understanding of those who had walked the same path. Near the water's edge, a group of men examined the ship with professional interest. "She's wounded but strong," one said to Kwame. "We can repair her, make her serve a new purpose. No more will she carry chains across the sea." The idea struck Kwame deeply. The vessel that had been their prison, then their salvation, could be transformed. "She needs a new name," he said, "something to mark her change." The elder woman nodded in agreement. "Among our people, we have a tradition of cleansing places of pain, turning them to good purpose. Tonight, we will help you reclaim this ship." As the day progressed, the survivors began to relax, to believe in their safety. The Maroons shared stories of their own escapes, their own battles for freedom. Each tale helped heal something in the newcomers' hearts, showing them they were not alone in their struggle. At sunset, everyone gathered on the beach. The ship loomed behind them, its shadow stretching across the sand. Kwame held Abena's colorful headscarf in his hands. Someone had recovered it from the deck after the battle. The fabric still carried her scent, still held memories of her songs and her strength. The elder woman led them in a ceremony, mixing traditions from different peoples into something new and powerful. Drums began to beat, their rhythm matching the pulse of the waves. Voices rose in harmony, songs of grief transforming into hymns of liberation. Kwame stepped into the surf, the chains from Hargreaves heavy in his hands. These links had bound him, had killed his enemy, had marked his journey from captive to leader. Now they had served their purpose. With all his strength, he hurled them far out into the waters. Others followed his example. Every piece of iron that had bound them, every symbol of their captivity, was cast into the sea. The waves accepted each offering, pulling them down into the depths where they would rust away to nothing. Laughter began to rise from the shore, tentative at first, then growing stronger. It was the sound of people remembering joy, rediscovering the ability to feel something beyond fear and rage. Children from the settlement started teaching the newcomers their games, the simple pleasure of playing in the sand healing wounds no medicine could touch. Kwame stood at the water's edge, Abena's scarf clutched in his hand. He raised his eyes to the setting sun, its light turning the sky into a canvas of reds and golds. The sight reminded him of her quiet strength, her unwavering belief in their future. "This place," he whispered, the words carried away by the gentle breeze, "will be built on freedom, not fear." He lifted the scarf high, letting it flutter in the wind like a banner of hope. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please like the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.